All right, thank you guys so much. We are finally back with another Seeing Through Gebser video. I want to first and foremost thank you guys for your patience. Things have, I don't want to say hectic, but things change now that I've become a father, and so just this last week, I was just super busy with work and with finishing up finals week for school. And I just simply didn't have time, unfortunately. But now I do, so thank you guys so much. You guys are the best. If I sound a little quieter today, my child's in the other room trying to sleep, so I'm not going to be too loud here. But today, I'm very happy to announce that. Now, obviously, I think the preceding 339 pages in this book, and on this edition we are on page 340, I think it's brilliant. I think it's absolutely genius. I think it's incredible. Having said that, I think, unless I'm missing something, from this point on until the end, I think it's, I don't want to sound over the top, I think it's some of the best writings in Western civilization history. I know that sounds a little over the top, but that's just my opinion. I assume you guys appreciate Gebser. Maybe you don't go that far. But let me know if you disagree, because you academics, you guys do have a broader knowledge base. So I don't want to sound like I'm just kind of, I don't want to sound like a sycophant, but I also want to be honest too. So without further ado, let's get into it. We are talking about the fourth dimension today. We're going to be going through a little brief history. Now, this video, this section, it's probably going to take at least 2 or 3 videos, maybe even 4. I hope not, but we're going to be doing a little brief history of the fourth dimension in today's video, and then we're going to be finishing out the fourth dimension in the next couple of videos. So, without further ado, let's get right into it. Quote, "The fourth dimension is freedom from time, i.e. the achronon." Achronon, not chronon, right? Chronology. That's, of course, the root of chronological time. That would be rational understanding of time. The fourth dimension is freedom from that, to be freed from the restraints of viewing time exclusively in the external measurable sense. We should still retain the clock and the calendar and that stuff. I think it's important, but I think it needs to be put back in its proper place. It's not real time, but it does allow us to order the world, and we should have a certain degree of order. The rationalists are correct about that. The fourth dimension is not the concept of merely measurable time, but the quote-unquote form of the temporal or temporistic principle, which we have defined as time freedom. This is of decisive importance. By the way, got my Kevin De Bruyne special edition. Pretty cool, huh? My girlfriend got it for me. Okay. Since the fourth dimension has had a determining role in our epoch, indeed has become its hallmark, particularly since Einstein, we must examine it more closely. For the sake of clarity, we should note at the outset that all definitions of the fourth dimension, which utilize one of the previous forms of time, are temporic endeavors. They are the expression of the new efforts to solve the problem of time, which has been deliberately suppressed for centuries. We should also note that all previous attempts of a categorical nature were inadequate inasmuch as the quote-unquote time complex is acategorical. The problem was posed but not resolved, and it cannot, in fact, be solved categorically. So what we're going to be talking about, like he said, is thinking about time, what it is, and how it connects to the world. That sort of is the hallmark of a lot of our thought, especially in science. We're going to be going through that, and he calls them temporic endeavors. So that's what we're going to be going through, a sort of history of temporic endeavors. And that's another thing. Time, real time as an intensity, is acategorical. There's a point in here, but it's actually an invisible, efficacious element. The structure of the process of consciousness emergence as it occurred in dimensioning, which we have carried out in the present discussion, is an additional reason for us to examine the essence of the new dimension. And an additional circumstance must be mentioned. Only time in the form of chronological time, or as a geometricized magnitude, is strictly speaking a dimension or mensuration. In the true sense of time freedom, as an acategorical element, the fourth dimension is an amension. Now, it's funny, when I first read this, I looked up, I didn't ask ChatGPT, I should have, and I looked up, what does amension mean on Google, and nothing came up. So I think, what do they call it, a neologism? Like, it's just a new word you make up for a new concept. More power to you. But an amension is without measurability. A dimension is a measurable extension or aspect of reality. An amention means it is without that measurability. So, of course, time being a transcendence of the visual, perceptible, prospectively correct, visible rationality, it is invisible. The rationalists cannot understand this. They cannot take into account anything invisible. They just won't do it. Ask a rationalist, by the way, when they deny that anything invisible exists, ask them, do you agree your psyche exists? They're all going to say yes. Put it on the table for me and just see what they say. When we nonetheless retain the term dimension, our usage is justified by the dissolution and integration of the three spatial dimensions wrought by the fourth dimension. It resolves their measurability and in a certain sense measures through them. Only when understood in this way is it permissible to apply the traditional notion of dimension to the acategorical and integrative fourth component. So for an example, in geometry, right, or mathematical, we have three dimensions. So the first dimension would be length, right? The second dimension would be length and width, and then the third dimension would be length, width, height. These are dimensions that in many ways time as a fourth dimension, as an acategorical amention, operates in the sense of it is an aspect of reality. So it's similar to traditional dimensions in that sense, but it is invisible. So in many ways it meets the functions of traditional dimensions. You just can't measure it. It just is what it is. The notion that quote-unquote time is a, quote, heterogeneous dimension, unquote, of space lying, quote, transverse, unquote, as it were, to the vertical spatial dimensions resting upon it, was formulated by no less a figure than ontologist Nikolai Hartmann. I'm going to read that without the quotes because that's a good line, but I messed it up. The notion that time is a heterogeneous dimension of space lying transverse, as it were, to the vertical spatial dimensions resting upon it, was formulated by no less a figure than the ontologist Nikolai Hartmann in his last work, published in 1950, The Philosophy of Nature. So interesting when he says time is a heterogeneous dimension of space. So notice the conjoining of space and time. They've only been artificially divided. Now we are reconjoining them. The 18 chapters of part 1 of his book are devoted to dimensional categories and provide an ontological categorical analysis of 3 and 4 dimensionality. This analysis fails and at the same time fulfills itself philosophically. That's one of Gebser's big critiques of philosophy. It fails to meet the demands of 4D integral consciousness, and yet it, viewed purely in its own perspective, it's everything's fine, everything's great. He says all the philosophies have a limited validity. By being unable to proceed beyond the definitions mentioned above, the compulsion to system and the categorical thinking inherent in it are philosophically a dead end and prevent the perception of systatic elements. We have indicated this impasse in order to show that the terminological difficulty has already become apparent to categorical thinking, although it is content to define the fourth dimension as heterogeneous, and, in so doing, merely avoids the issue by falling back into dualism. In order to deal with this concept, which is central to the new perception of the world, it is appropriate for us, concept in quotes, by the way, it is appropriate for us to reconstruct the genesis of the concept of the fourth dimension, and to observe the sphere of thought and the cognitive discipline from which it arose, as well as the disciplines that have subsequently modified and adopted it. Did he misspell that? D-E-S-C-I-P-L-I-N-E. Academics, has that ever been used like that? The point of departure for the notion of space of more than 3 dimensions, be it of 4, 5, 6, or n dimensions, was Euclid's parallel axiom. The undemonstrability of this axiom was first recognized by Friedrich W. Gauss. Let me slow down. I think we've already mentioned Euclid in this series, but if not, I'm going to just do a little quick reminder. So, of course, Euclid's axioms, what are they really? They are vanishing points. They are laws of 2D geometry. Right, or even 3D geometry, excuse me. No, I think it's 2D geometry, that's what it is. So things like all right angles add up to 90 degrees, a point is 2 dots connected by, or a line is 2 points, I don't know, I'm not a freaking mathematician. Very basic mathematical, geometrical vanishing points. Another one, if you have 2 parallel lines, they'll never intersect. that, my friend, did not sit right with certain scientists, and they would go on to demonstrate the undemonstrability of Euclid's parallel axiom. So essentially, I'm pretty sure it was 2D. I'm pretty sure it might have been 3D, but whatever dimension Euclid was working with, that would be transcended by the guys we're about to mention. The undemonstrability of this axiom was first recognized by Friedrich W. Gauss, but since he feared the outcry of the Boetians, he did not publish anything about the geometry he had constructed without the parallel postulate, which was to become the cornerstone of non-Euclidean geometry. Two Germans, Schweikart and his nephew Taurinus, were also occupied with such a possibility, and their demonstration occurred independently of Gauss in 1825. So if you guys want to dig into this further, I have a Substack article called What is Time, and it gets into all this. It's kind of a little bit of a spoiler for this, but what we're seeing here is many scientists at the exact same time are discovering non-Euclidean geometry. Now I'm going to let Gebser explain it, but it's interesting things going on. Besides these attempts, there were further demonstrations, again pursued independently, by the Russian N.J. Lobachevsky in 1829 and the Hungarian Joe Bolyai, B-O-L-Y-A-I, in 1832. Another advance came with B. Riemann's inaugural lecture of 1854 on the hypothesis on which geometry is based, which further demonstrated the possibility of a non-Euclidean geometry. Riemann added his elliptical geometry, in which the sum of angles exceeds 180 degrees, and which is designated as the, quote, second type of non-Euclidean geometry, unquote, to the geometry proposed by Lobachevsky, which was hyperbolic, in which the sum of the angles is less than 180 degrees, and which is called the first type of non-Euclidean geometry. So what Lobachevsky did is, remember, with Euclid, we have the sum of all angles equals 180. That has to be parallel. That's a law, if you will, of geometry. Well, unfortunately, as Riemann, who showed that no, with a new dimension or from a certain perspective, all angles can lead up to or add up to more than 180 degrees, so we can drop that. And then Lobachevsky did the other way, where he said, no, that is possible, but you could also add up all the angles, so it can equal less than 180 degrees. So we are very clearly breaking from the traditional Euclidean geometry with its vanishing points, which is showing the transcendence from rationality to irrationality. These non-Euclidean geometries made it possible to represent spaces having more than 3 dimensions. That's very, very, very important. I will repeat for emphasis, because this is the point of non-Euclidean geometry. Why is it a transcendence of space? Why isn't it just a regression to irrational nonsense? Because these non-Euclidean geometries made it possible to represent spaces having more than 3 dimensions. So, of course, rationality is confined to 3D space. One particular form of these n-dimensioned conceptions of space was elaborated in 1905 by Einstein, who utilized and generalized Riemann's conception in his special theory of relativity, Riemann being the one where you add the angles and they add to more than 180 degrees. There he postulated the four-dimensional unity of space and time and demonstrated its validity for certain phenomena, whereby the constant that unifies time and space is the speed of light. So this, I'm going to repeat just because if, maybe you're a philosopher, I didn't know anything about Einstein's discovery before I read this, so it's cool to see what he did. Let's repeat for emphasis. There he postulated the four-dimensional unity of space and time and demonstrated its validity for certain phenomena, whereby the constant that unifies time and space is the speed of light. So the speed of light is the constant that unifies space and time into space-time. That is what Einstein proved, which is awesome. To the spatial coordinates A, B, and C was added the new fourth coordinate t, time, where t equals the square root of -1, which as the number I refers to the next greater coordinate system. This made possible the mathematical description of certain spatial phenomena, particularly those related, particularly those relative to one another as a result of having two different points of observation. So all this talk about relativity with Einstein, this is what it is. This made possible the mathematical description of certain spatial phenomena, particularly those relative to one another as a result of having two different points of observation. If I'm sitting here, stationary on Earth, you are up in a rocket ship moving at the speed of light. I set my clock for 10 years, you set your clock for 10 years. When 10 years goes by, I will have aged 10 years. You will have aged 5 years. If you've watched Interstellar, you know exactly what we're talking about here. Einstein made it possible to explain this phenomena mathematically, which is obviously very impressive. Let us pause. This is important. Let us pause and observe for the moment that by introducing time as a fourth dimension, Einstein made possible changes in our knowledge of certain phenomena and occurrences which altered the foundation of physics and mechanics. So, the addition of the fourth dimension completely changed the game in physics, just like it changes, as we're going to see with the rest of this book, it changes the game for pretty much every discipline. Even music. I'm on the music section right now. It changes the game. But when we speak today of a fourth dimension, a wider frame of reference than that of Einstein's theory of relativity forces itself upon the observer, one which links the fourth dimension not merely with time or even the measurable time of particular movements or velocities, as in the case of Einstein's theory, but rather with the assumption of an invisibly efficacious component. So this is why I always say Gebser has an even better understanding of even Einstein. I think he has the best understanding of time anyone's ever had, because he recognized that yes, this sort of invisible fourth dimension can be tied to space, but it goes even beyond that. But here's a very, very, very important, this last line he throws in. But rather with the assumption of an invisibly efficacious component. Time essentially is an invisible intensity of energy that integrates and generates. That will more or less be the common through line we see with time here. But it is invisible. Rationalist, you need to go away, all right? These guys. As early as 1864 or 65, in a series of lectures on psychophysics held during the winter of that year at the University of Graz, Ernest Mach had propounded the notion of a spatial conception augmented by an additional dimension, and suggested it as an explanation of previously inexplicable physical phenomena. So first we had Einstein with the purely mechanical physics way. Now we have Mach, who's tying it to psychophysics, kind of. The notion of a spatial augmented and suggests as okay. Mach did this without knowledge of Riemann's concept, which was not published until 1867. So we have another person discovering this new dimension that we're calling time. Very interesting at the same time, and that they're all independent of each other. Whereas Einstein's conception of a fourth dimension is purely epistemological and physical geometrical, Mach's conception has a distinctly psychophysical coloration, despite his positivist and phenomenological viewpoint, his so-called empirio-criticism. At the hands of the materialist psychist, however, remember, psychist is essentially someone who can't get out of their own psyche. Everything, why is my hat like this? Everything gets interpreted through the lens of the psyche. Why the hell? What is going on with my hat? And think young, right? There's a world going on outside of your head. There is a world that can be psychologized away, just like rationalists rationalize everything away. It probably shouldn't, don't you think? And add that with materialism, now we got a problem. Now you really can't have any spirit. You leave no room for the spiritual moment. Okay. Predominantly psychic character. They incorporated it into their cloudy field of inquiry as the quote-unquote occult component of nature, and attempted to clarify in a spiritistic manner the partially hidden, partially manifest substructure of nature. Among these psychists was the astrophysicist Friedrich Zollner, who in 1886 published his The Natural Sciences and Christian Revelation. In his ideological wake followed all of those circles who were prompted from a mediumistic and materialistic standpoint to describe the supersensory as the fourth dimension whenever it made an appearance at their spiritistic seances. So with Einstein, we had his conception. With Mach, we had the, as he described it, psychophysics conception. And now with the the materialist psychists, we get essentially the spiritual, almost occultish dimension here, where it almost feels like they're describing paraphenomenon, and they're just trying to call that the fourth dimension. The disingenuous latter-day mystics, who are exemplified by Maurice Maeterlinck, also belong to this entourage. These mystics describe the effects of their mystical attitude which is only a re-immersion into the pure polarity of the psyche and the manifestation of its resultant powers, as being four-dimensional. But they fail to recognize that instead of superseding the three-dimensional world, they subsede it, as it were, in the reversion to a two-dimensional world. So that's the problem with these mystic guys, that they say. All the bliss, all the benefits to be derived from a return to a healthy, or maybe not return, but a reactivation of a healthy, balanced mythical structure. It is good, it is nice, it is nonetheless a regression. We're not, again, you can't transcend by going from 2D to 3D back to 2D, okay? It's not going to work. Or, to mention yet another and final interpretation of the fourth dimension, which should be included in this summary, we should note that of the contemporary French quote-unquote traditionalists in the circle of Art Guénon, as represented by Raoul Auclair and Raymond Abellio. These men are also among the proponents of the widespread and vigorous esoteric movement in France, which follows in the footsteps of Saint Martin, Fabre Dolivet, Saint de Goetia, Eliphas Levi, Saint Yves de oh my God, dude. No wonder these guys are so snooty. My God. I mean, what is this? Saint Yves de Alverde Matgo. This sounds like something Helen Keller would just kind of, something that would just leave her mouth. And Pappus. I love how after all that it ends with the 5-letter Pappus, okay, among others. They consider the ether as the fourth dimension, which they understand not in the Greek sense as an element, but as a primordial, extra-spatial, and extra-temporal phenomenon. So, even this brief summary reveals two telling facts. One is the remarkable circumstance that non-Euclidean geometry was discovered simultaneously by several independent researchers. The other is the far-reaching adaptation of the concept of a fourth dimension by representatives of the most disparate disciplines and attitudes. Really just kind of plainly, beautifully said. 2 big points. 1, non-Euclidean geometry was discovered by 5 different people at completely independent of each other at the same time. That is a sign. That is a sign. Number 2, this is the new thing. It's like kind of like postmodernity in the 60s. This is what we do. A wide variance of disciplines are trying to integrate the fourth dimension. This signals that it is coming to our consciousness. Let us first examine the question of the simultaneous discovery, which of course we are not the first to observe. That's of course of non-Euclidean geometry. Egmont Collaeris, too, has noted this phenomenon and observed that the concept of non-Euclidean geometries represents perhaps the most significant revolution in the history of science and makes possible for the first time a conception of a fourth dimension. So, in the math world, it must have been a big deal. Gauss, as we have seen, was occupied with the parallel axiom as early as 1799 and was the first to conceive of a non-Euclidean geometry, but he did not publish anything about it, a circumstance to which we will return shortly. Gauss first alluded to this discovery in a letter of the great astronomer Bessel in 1829, and when the law student Schweikart informed him of his own essentially identical geometry, Gauss openly praised Schweikart. In 1825, Schweikart's nephew Tyrannus published a discussion on the subject, which was followed in 1829 by N.J. Lobachevsky's exposition of his discovery of non-Euclidean geometry at the University of Kazan, and independently of the others, J. Belai published in 1832 his non-Euclidean geometry, which was basically identical to that of Gauss. Including Gauss, there were then no fewer than 5 scholars, Gauss, Schweikart, and Tyrannus in Germany, Lobachevsky in Russia, and Belai in Hungary, who, within 1 decade, realized independently of each other that form of geometry which allowed conclusions from which a four-dimensional world could proceed. Very cool. In any event, the quadruplicity of discovery of this particular concept, which was to transform the world, is a remarkable circumstance. And here we should mention the further and highly unusual fact that Gauss himself did not publish the results of his discovery, but merely alluded to it once in his letter of 1829 to the renowned astronomer Bessel. Of this, Collaeris remarked that, quote, "Such unusual behavior by the greatest of mathematicians is today still in need of a psychological historical explanation," unquote. This is a really interesting connection that Gebser makes. I find it to be quite fascinating. This coincidental and yet remarkable this coincidental. Oh, I missed the wrong paragraph. Sorry about that. In need of a psychological historical explanation. Now this is Gebser. Gauss's behavior is perhaps better understood if viewed as a parallel to Petrarch's reaction in a similar situation of discovery. Remember, we discussed Petrarch. Pop quiz. What structure, mental structure, if you will, or how about this? What preceding discovery that birthed the mental structure did Petrarch discover? Pop quiz. When in 1336, some 500 years before Gauss, Petrarch discovered landscape while climbing Mount Ventoux, a discovery which opened up space and the realization of the third dimension. He was so shaken by his world-transforming discovery that he mentioned it only to one person in a letter. When Gauss discovered non-Euclidean geometry, which, as a result of its n-dimensionality, made possible the realization of the four-dimensional continuum, he reported this world-transforming find to only one person in a letter. Pretty fascinating stuff, don't you think? Anytime rationalists try to explain this away as a coincidence, I don't know what to say. It's staring you right in the face, but okay. Kind of like stuff like the axial age. Come on. It's staring you in the face. There's something going on here. Something immaterial and spiritual going on here. This is the great thing about Gebser. He gives you these really cool connections, but then he kind of undermines himself because he's not trying to build you some mythology that's just here to make him look smart. He doesn't care about that. He wants to get close to reality. So in many ways, he'll make a claim and then kind of undermine himself, as we're about to see. This coincidental and yet remarkable parallelism can even be extended, with the requisite reservations, to a parallel quadruplicity of the discovery of landscape that, so far as we can determine, also took place within the space of approximately 1 decade. So we have another mirroring, another pattern that is being mirrored, where, as we mentioned, all those scientists who in one decade discovered non-Euclidean geometry, well, the same thing happened 300, 400, 500 years ago when all these artists, as we're about to see, discovered perspective. This awakening consciousness of space broke forth independently 4 times during the years 1327 to 1337, and the frescoes of Assisi by the brothers Lorenzetti, and the last works of Giotto, in the Arabic Sufi manuscripts of the same year, and in the aforementioned letter of Petrarch to Francesco Dionigi di Borgo San Sepolcro. Okay. No other possibilities of reality of the last 600 years have had so great, indeed so fundamental an impact on the forms of realization of European man. Our suggestion that there is a certain parallelism of discovery and the mode of communication of these two realities should not, however, be looked upon as an attempt to fit the events into a questionable theory of parallelism. So he's drawing parallels, but he's saying, look, my argument does not rely on parallels. There's a parallel that exists, but don't think that because this parallel doesn't manifest in the magic and the mythic structures that this is going to tear down my entire philosophy. It's not. He's too smart for that. The events cannot be generalized to the extent that all occurrences could be included in a straitjacketed system of simultaneous occurrence, a kind of perpetually recurring cosmic Tellurian time table or cycle. That sounds almost mythical structure to me. On the other hand, we cannot ignore the fact that all manifestations which occur within the terrestrial arena are at least in part necessarily subject to those laws and forms of manifestation that are naturally valid on Earth and co-determine their unfolding. I think what he's saying is there's a spiritual dimension at play here. Despite this reservation and admission, we would also point to a further circumstance deserving of our attention because it expresses a certain surprising structural regularity or symmetry. To be sure, we must proceed here with great caution, and must also be prepared to temper the influence of categorical considerations imposed by our thinking on events which themselves have their own intrinsic, origin-given order. But it is permissible for us, and this is of considerable importance, to regard fundamental manifestations that become truly visible because of their own origin-given freedom, which are thus unimpeded by categories we have constructed as being coincident or consistent. This is particularly true of the initial manifestation of two genuinely mutational phenomena which avail themselves of different areas or disciplines of human endeavor for their potential realization. We have included this caution in order to counter possible objections that might be raised when we venture to relate to one another the respective first manifestation of a three and then a four-dimensional reality. In the case of Petrarch, the upsurge of a new potential dimension occurred in the realm of the soul or spirit, whereas with Gauss and his contemporaries it took place in the purely mathematical, that is, essentially mental realm. So again, He's doing his best to give this disclaimer. Don't get lost in the parallelism. We can speak on parallels, but it's not the foundation of our argument here. In each instance, the realm corresponds to the respective consciousness structure of the epoch in which their initiators lived. With this proviso, drawn from the realm of the history of the mind rather than from a strictly scientific or exact interpretation of such living contexts and manifestations, we may now proceed to examine the question of regularity or symmetry. And that, my friend, is where we will stop today. I love you guys. I was so glad to get back on the Gebser train. I miss you guys. I'm going to try my best to get you guys two this week. Maybe tomorrow, maybe most likely maybe Thursday night, Friday night, maybe when I come home after work. So love you guys. We're getting into it now, so I hope you guys are enjoying it. Next up, we still have 2 or 3 more videos of this fourth dimension stuff, but after that we're going to be doing manifestations of the a-perspectival world, the natural sciences. So we're going to be getting into how integral consciousness is manifesting in science after this. So I love you guys so much. You guys are the best. Thank you guys for your patience again, and I'll see you guys in next week's Gebser video. Love you.